Thanks, Ethan. So this is a very, I think, nice example of combining maybe, two of the technologies we already discussed today, right? One is a model of the world, which they have, and two is some natural language processing, where they take the paragraph, and this is to your point, the computer was taking a human-readable paragraph and looking for entities which it could recognize within them, and understanding them basically on context, and then linking those entities to the database about the real world. So that's a really cool example.
But it's all passive.
Sorry?
But it's all passive data. It's not active. I mean, the entities are not interacting with each other.
I want to comment on this. Actually, we have in the works, we already have working, also active sources of data. There are issues with it, and the most stable part is indeed passive. But
you're looking at some dynamic data feeds that come in.
For example, you can take YouTube videos and things will change all the time.
So here's one other example of what someone else has done with this. So I type in Bejala, and it gives me several. Am I looking at Bejala Lions, whatever that is? Am I looking at the town?
It's the local rugby.
It's the what? The local
rugby.
Seriously?
Really?
Beit Jala is an Arab Christian town in the Bethlehem Governorate of the West Bank. Beit Jala is located 10 kilometers south of Jerusalem, on the western side of the Hebron Road, opposite Bethlehem, at 825 meters altitude in 1997. Beit Jala had 12,239 inhabitants, predominantly Christian Palestinians with a Muslim minority, according to the Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics. The Beit Jala Lions is a rugby club active in Beit Jala since 2007, hailed as the first all-Palestinian rugby.
There's a data error, right? You see the data's not perfect, but you see what they've done here. And, this is the kind of example which is great. This is the kind of example. I think some people were offended by that picture, but you see what they've done. You see a few things from that little example, right? First of all, this is something a startup did quite quickly, right? They took all the data's coming out of Wikipedia, right? They didn't really do anything very intelligent. They used Beit Jala, they looked it up in Wikipedia, they piped it into a speech synthesizer, they probably searched Flickr for photos, they put the photos in a nice slideshow. So by combining a few simple resources like Wikipedia, Flickr, and a voice synthesizer, they created a very nice effect. And you also see the example that the data is not perfect, yeah? There's some mistakes, but it was fun to watch anyway.
Zvi, question. In your case, the website that you have, where it looks at Wikipedia, the section of Wikipedia that you read, not the free text, is that in a specific format? And what format is that in?
Okay, so...
and in the case of Etan, when you search against, you find which category it is. Where do you look that up? Like, just to get a little context.
Wikipedia has categories inside it.
Okay.
Yeah, they have templates which are not 100% consistent, but there is a template in Wikipedia that says when you present an actor, list of films, co-stars, so there's a fairly good template for that stuff. Okay, we should move on because we've got about 10 minutes. I'm going to talk just very briefly about cooperation models. The most obvious one is commercial. I doubt that in the hackathon we're going to get into commercial, but companies are still the most obvious way to build software projects. Software can be very profitable. It's also very risky. There's a lot of competition. And there's a lot of consolidation happening. More and more software is coming from Microsoft, IBM, Oracle, making it harder and harder for startups. Open source is interesting. I'll say a few words about that. Open source basically says, software is something, it doesn't cost anything to produce. It costs to develop software, but it doesn't cost to produce them, right? I can make as many copies of my software as I like. There's no unit cost. So some people said, well, software can get cheaper and cheaper because it's not like a car. It doesn't cost me anything to produce each extra copy. And then some people said, you know what, we're going to give software away for free. It's a big movement. There are about 2 million developers registered with SourceForge, which is the biggest repository of open source. There's some huge successes. Linux, famously, Firefox, Apache, right, MySQL, which then got bought by Oracle, OpenOffice. Quite a lot of these have got corporate sponsorships. So Google, of course, sponsors Chrome and Android, but it is open source. For example, Google wants to sponsor Android because they want people to search Google on their phone. But some cell companies may take, I'll take questions later, I think, yeah? Some cell companies, what?
I feel the urge to insist on correcting you that open source is not necessarily free.
Yeah.
It's a big important issue. Because
That's
open
free
source
software,
means that the information is not free as a beer that you buy for free, that you get for free. It's free in the sense that it's open, you can use it for specific license. Depends how the.
I don't understand.
It's a big difference.
I don't understand.
If anybody can explain it better than
Red
me.
Hat sells you the software for free.
It's a big difference.
No, Red Hat software, Linux is open source. You can get the software for free. Red Hat are selling you other things, right? They're selling you services which are in addition. But if I know the open source licenses quite well, and they do require that you cannot sell open source code for money. It has to be free.
Sell it, but
As in beer, but you can sell a lot of things
you can
around
sell
it.
it, but you can also not sell it. It's you are allowed to distribute it. You can distribute it with pay, but you're not supposed to necessarily.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure that's. I don't know. I think it's
open source, as long as you keep it open source.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's not have a debate about this now. Anyway, all these products are available for free, and as far as I understand, source code, which is open source, has to be available for free. But some people are disputing that. So why do people open source? Some people are doing it out of idealism, right? They just love software being free. They do it for fun. Some people are doing it because they want to sell things around it. So MySQL sold support. Android pushes Google search. But Android is open source. So if a cell phone carrier wants to take Android and combine it with Bing, they can. And some carriers may do that. So that's the risk of open source. You lose control of the source code. Of course, when you make something open source, you may get the community contributing, at least contributing QA and feedback. Sometimes you may actually get developers contributing code. And it's often a strategy as a way to, in fact, one of the biggest drives behind open source was to counter Microsoft. Right? That's why some pushed Java, that's why Google pushed Chrome, that's why IBM pushed Eclipse and also Java, and that's why some push OpenOffice. So a lot of the motivation is saying we can't compete with Microsoft for money, we're going to have free open source software which competes with Microsoft. One of the problems, and I recommend the teams can decide if they want to open source stuff they develop, but certainly for a quick project which is developed in a collaborative way, I think open source is highly recommended for the teams here. Let me say just 2 words about the sort of 2 major categories of licenses, that there are many open source licenses. These are perhaps the most famous 4 which have no restrictions. You're licensing the source code and people can do what they like with the source code, including turning it into a commercial product. Okay, so they can modify the software and turn it into a commercial product which is then for pay. GPL and AGPL GPL is the most famous license which said this product is open source, and if you build something out of it, that must be open source as well. One of the challenges for GPL is that you could take a GPL program and turn it into something and then host it. So you can't give out the source code for money, but you can host the source code. And AGPL fixes that loophole. So if you license your software over AGPL, and I take it and change it, and then put it on my website as a hosted service, I must make my source code available. I think the biggest threat to open source is that people aren't giving out software very much anymore. They're giving out services on the web, right? So more and more software is as a service on a website, Google Docs, Gmail, Facebook. These are things which are used as a site. And that actually does cost money to host. So if I want to compete with Google search, I need to have servers. So that's, it may be open source, but I've got real costs. Another, GPL has got this problem I mentioned, although AGPL fixes it. One idea I want to discuss, I'm only going to mention this very briefly now, but one idea I want to discuss and get feedback on at this conference is that maybe the next model, when you have hosting and you have real costs, is to create cooperatives where the developers actually do own rights in the code, and you can sort of get together and build software together over the web and host it as a service, and then it's controlled by all the people who contribute, but it's not open source. The source is owned by all the people who contributed, and they all have shares and they all vote on sort of what to do with it. So this co-op idea is just something which interests me, and I'm keen to get some feedback on that. We're running towards the deadline, so I'm going to move on to general technologies and resources. I'm going to do this bit very quickly because most of you know this, but just some technologies which are important to mention. For source control, SVN is probably the leading technology. CVS and Mesurial are two competitions. The two most important repositories you might want to use if you do open source a project are, of course, SourceForge, which is, I think, still the biggest, and Google Code, which is growing very rapidly, especially for web-oriented projects. There's no statistics for Google Code that I saw, but there are 260,000 open source projects on SourceForge. Another possibility, if you do not want to open source your project, you can install SVN on an SVN server on one of your laptops and use that as a repository for the team. So that's also an option. In terms of technologies, I mean, this is almost like a religious battle, but I'm a fan of Java. It is open source. It's platform independent. It will run, on Windows and on all the other operating systems. It's mature and has many libraries, so that's probably a good choice for many projects. But if your project decides to develop in C# or Ruby or Perl or whatever else, then that's fine. I think this is sort of almost obvious at this point, but I strongly recommend, and again, up to you, but recommend as much as possible to create apps which are hosted, which are available on a website, rather than creating install software. That seems to be very much the trend, and when you write on the web, then people can run it on any device. They can run it on Windows machines, they can run it on iPads. I saw someone here with their iPad, right? They can run it on their smartphone. So the web is clearly the common denominator,